"Meet my loser sister who still lives with roommates," my brother announced at his wedding. The crowd laughed until his new boss walked in, hugged me, and said, 200 people laughing at me in a rented tux jacket and a dress I'd bought on clearance 3 days before the wedding. That's how my brother's big night started for me. And if you'd told me an hour earlier that it would end the way it did, I would not have believed you. Nothing about that morning suggested anything but another long day of making myself small so someone else could feel tall. I want to start further back than the wedding, because the wedding wasn't really the beginning of anything. It was just the night everything that had been building for 20-some years finally had somewhere to go. Growing up, my brother was the sun our whole house orbited around. And I don't mean that as some bitter exaggeration. I mean it structurally, the way you'd describe a solar system. Every schedule bent around his practices. Every dinner conversation eventually found its way back to whatever he'd done that day, no matter how small. When he made the varsity baseball team as a sophomore, my dad went out that weekend and bought a new camera, a real one, the kind with lenses you swap out just so he could film every single game from the good seats behind home plate. I remember standing next to him at one of those games, maybe 11 years old, watching him adjust the zoom with this look of total concentration, like he was documenting something historic. I never asked him to buy a camera for anything I did, because it never occurred to either of us that there would be anything worth filming. That's not self-pity. That's just how the house was built. My parents weren't cruel people. They weren't the kind of parents who said unkind things to your face or punished you for existing. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to point to, which is exactly why it took me so long to understand what had actually happened to me. It was the difference between being seen and being present. I was present at every dinner, every holiday, every family photo. I answered when spoken to. I did well in school without anyone needing to push me, which turned out to be its own kind of curse, because kids who don't cause problems don't get much attention in a house that only has so much attention to spread around. If I brought up something at dinner, some small thing that had happened at school or later, at work, the table would go quiet in this specific way, like everyone was waiting politely for me to finish so the real conversation could resume. My brother had a gift for filling that silence. He'd let me get about halfway through a sentence and then say something like, "Still living with those roommates?" with this grin on his face, like he was doing me a favor by changing the subject before I embarrassed myself further. And here's the thing that used to make me the angriest. Looking back, everyone would laugh. Not meanly, not even loudly, just this soft, familiar chuckle, like it was an old joke everyone had agreed to keep telling. And that was always enough. One sentence delivered at exactly the right moment, and my entire life got reduced to a punchline everybody already understood without needing an explanation. I used to lie awake some nights as a teenager trying to figure out what I had done to deserve being the background character in my own family. I never landed on an answer, because there wasn't one. Some kids get to be main characters, and some kids get cast as scenery, and it usually has less to do with what you've earned and more to do with which sibling arrived first and louder. When I got my scholarship letter my senior year of high school, the kind of full-ride offer that made my guidance counselor actually gasp out loud when she saw the numbers, I brought it home and put it on the kitchen counter where my mom would see it. She read it, said something like, "That's wonderful, honey," in a tone that suggested she meant it, and then set it down on top of a stack of grocery coupons she was sorting through. I found it 3 days later, still sitting there, slightly damp from a glass of water that had been placed on the corner of it. She'd genuinely forgotten where she'd put it. I know because when I asked her about it a week later, she looked confused for a second before remembering, and I watched her realize what that forgetting must have looked like from where I stood. I didn't say anything. I never said anything. That was sort of my specialty. My brother, meanwhile, could fail spectacularly and still walk away with applause. He mangled the turkey every single Thanksgiving for 4 years running before he finally got the hang of carving. And every single one of those years, the table laughed and clapped like he'd performed some kind of magic trick. I passed the rolls. I refilled water glasses. I listened to people compliment a turkey that looked like it had lost a fight. None of this would matter much on its own. Families have weird internal weather systems, and most people carry some version of this story around with them, some sibling who got more sunlight. What made ours different, I think, is that it never stopped. It didn't taper off once we became adults, the way you'd expect a childhood dynamic to soften with distance and independence. If anything, it calcified. By the time I was in my late 20s, the roles were so fixed that nobody in my family, myself included, could really imagine them any other way. I had become, in the collective family shorthand, the one who's still figuring things out, even though I had, by any reasonable measure, figured quite a lot of things out. My brother had become the one who's got it together, even though his version of together mostly consisted of a job he complained about constantly and a habit of living slightly beyond whatever he was earning. Nobody in my family asked me many questions about my life, and I stopped offering information because offering information into a silence that doesn't want it just feels like talking to yourself with an audience. The people my brother called my roommates were not roommates, not in any sense that word usually carries. They were my co-founders, and the story of how the three of us ended up living above an office is a story I told exactly nobody in my family, because nobody had ever asked in a way that suggested they actually wanted the answer. I met them both in the same 6-month stretch, at a point in my life when I was working a job I was good at but didn't care about, the kind of job where you're competent enough that nobody worries about you, which is its own quiet trap. One of them I met at a conference I almost didn't attend, sitting next to me by accident in a session neither of us particularly wanted to be in, the two of us trading skeptical looks every time the speaker said the word synergy. The other I met through a mutual friend at a birthday dinner, the kind of dinner where you end up in a 2-hour conversation with a stranger about something neither of you can quite remember starting, except that by the end of it, we were sketching an idea on a napkin because neither of us wanted to lose the thread before we could write it down properly. The idea itself isn't the point of this story, not really, though I'll say it solved a real problem, the kind of unglamorous operational problem that doesn't sound exciting at a dinner party, but that businesses will genuinely pay to have solved. What matters more is what happened after we decided to actually try building it. We were all working full-time jobs when we started, which meant the company got built in the hours nobody else wanted. Early mornings before work, late nights after. Entire weekends disappeared into it. The three of us hunched over laptops in whichever apartment had the least noisy upstairs neighbor that week, eating whatever was cheapest and fastest, arguing about architecture decisions and pricing models and whether we were being too conservative or not conservative enough. I remember a stretch of about 4 months where I don't think I saw either of them in daylight more than a handful of times, because by the time we all finished our day jobs and reconvened, it was already dark, and by the time we stopped working, it usually wasn't. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from building something real, a tiredness that sits differently than the tiredness from a job you're just doing to collect a paycheck. It's a tiredness with a shape to it, because you can feel the thing you're building taking up more space in the world every week, even when the actual progress is slow and invisible to anyone who isn't in the room. Eventually, we reached the point every early company reaches, where continuing to build it around the edges of other obligations stopped being sustainable, and the three of us had a long, difficult conversation about whether we were serious enough to do this properly. All three of us quit our jobs within about 6 weeks of each other, which in retrospect was either extremely brave or extremely foolish, and possibly both at once. That's when the living situation started, though calling it a living situation makes it sound more deliberate than it actually was. We'd rented a small office space, the kind of place that used to be a dentist's practice or something equally unglamorous, with fluorescent lighting we never got around to replacing and carpet that had seen better decades. It had a small, unused room in the back that had probably once been a storage closet, and one night, after a stretch of work that had run past 2 in the morning for the third night running, one of us made the practical observation that driving home just to turn around and drive back in 4 hours was a waste of the little sleep we'd get anyway. Someone brought in a mattress, then another. Within a couple of months, all three of us had effectively relocated, not because we couldn't afford apartments, but because the company ran across time zones almost immediately once we landed our first international clients, and being physically present for calls at 3 in the morning mattered more than having a separate address to sleep at. People who haven't built something from nothing tend to hear a story like that and assume it must have been miserable, and there were certainly nights it felt that way. But there was also something in it I've never quite been able to explain to anyone outside of it, a kind of clarity that comes from being surrounded by people who see exactly what you're building and believe in it as much as you do, for the same reasons you do, without needing it explained or justified to them first. My family knew almost none of this. What they knew was the word roommates, delivered by my brother in a tone that made it sound like a diagnosis. I never corrected him. Not really. Not beyond a mumbled clarification here or there that got waved off before I could finish it. Part of that was pride, I think, a stubborn refusal to explain myself to people who hadn't earned the explanation by asking with any real curiosity. Part of it was something more practical. The company was still young enough, still fragile enough in those early years, that talking about it too loudly to people who would immediately want updates, numbers, proof, felt like tempting something. I've never been superstitious about much, but I was superstitious about that. So the years passed, and my family's picture of my life stayed roughly frozen at she has some tech thing going with her roommates, while the actual shape of what we'd built kept changing underneath that description, faster than anyone outside the three of us could have tracked even if they'd been paying attention, which they weren't. The wedding invitation had arrived 4 months earlier, a heavy cream envelope with calligraphy so ornate I had to read my own name twice to be sure it was actually addressed to me. I remember holding it in the office kitchen, one of my co-founders glancing over and asking whose wedding, and me saying my brother's, and them asking if I was excited, and me saying something non-committal because I genuinely didn't know how I felt about it yet. I flew in the night before the ceremony, alone, since the person I'd originally planned to bring had canceled at the last minute over a family emergency of his own, unrelated to me entirely. I didn't try to find a replacement date. Showing up alone to my brother's wedding felt, in a strange way, more honest than showing up with someone who would have had to sit through an evening of comments he didn't have the context to understand. The morning of the wedding, I spent longer than I'd like to admit deciding what to wear, and not because I cared about looking impressive. I cared about not giving my brother a reason. If I wore something too bright, he'd say I was trying to steal attention on his day. If I wore something too polished, he'd say I was showing off, using his wedding as some kind of stage. If I wore something too plain, he'd say I looked like I couldn't be bothered to make an effort, further proof of whatever narrative he already had running about me. So I chose quiet, a soft gray dress, simple heels, small earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. A woman trying to pass through her own family's biggest day of the year without giving anyone a single new thing to say about her. I arrived at the venue a little before the guest check-in closed, and the first thing I noticed before the flowers or the string quartet warming up near the marble staircase or the 5-tiered cake sitting under its own private spotlight was the seating chart propped up on an easel near the entrance. I scanned it the way you'd scan for your name on a list you weren't sure you wanted to find yourself on, and there I was, table 19, positioned close enough to the kitchen service doors that I could already hear the low clatter of trays being prepped crept behind them. My parents, predictably, were at table 1, the closest to the head table, angled for maximum visibility in every photo. My brother's college friends occupied table 2, a loud cluster of men in matching navy suits who'd clearly been drinking since the ceremony ended. His new wife's extended family filled the next 3 tables, an entire section of relatives I'd never met dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine spread, laughing easily with each other in the specific way families do when they've never had to question their place in the room. And then there was me, near the kitchen, between 2 second cousins I hadn't spoken to since some family reunion in my early 20s, and one of my brother's co-workers who spent the better part of dinner checking baseball scores on his phone under the table, glancing up just often enough to seem engaged. I told myself the seating didn't mean anything. Weddings are logistical nightmares, and seating charts get built around table sizes and who's willing to sit with whom, not around some deliberate ranking of who matters most. I told myself that through the entire first course, through the salad nobody at my table seemed interested in eating, through the low hum of conversation happening at every table except mine, where the silence kept threatening to stretch past comfortable. I watched my brother work the room during the cocktail hour that had preceded dinner, moving from table to table with his new wife on his arm, both of them glowing in that specific way people glow when they know every camera in the room is pointed at them. He caught my eye once from across the room and gave me this small, tight smile, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes, and something in my stomach tightened in a way I couldn't quite name yet. I told myself I was imagining it. I'd spent enough of my life reading warning signs into small gestures that weren't actually warnings, and I didn't want to spend his wedding day doing it again. His new wife found me before dinner started, floating past in ivory silk, squeezing my arm with this polite, practiced pressure that people use when they want credit for having been kind without actually having to do very much. "So glad you made it," she said, already looking past me towards someone more important to greet. I said something equally polite back, and that was the extent of our conversation for the evening. Dinner moved like a well-oiled machine once it actually started. Servers slipped between the tables with plates of glazed chicken and roasted vegetables arranged with more care than the food itself probably warranted. Forks scraped against expensive china. Somewhere near the front, at one of the tables full of his wife's relatives, someone laughed loudly at a joke I couldn't hear the setup for. The hired string quartet had apparently finished their contracted set, replaced now by a playlist of soft, forgettable pop songs that no one at my table seemed to actually be listening to. I stayed where I'd been placed, smiling when spoken to, answering questions about my flight and the weather, and whether I'd tried the chicken, keeping my responses just substantial enough to seem normal without inviting any follow-up that might lead somewhere I didn't want the conversation to go. The coworker beside me eventually gave up on his phone long enough to ask what I did for work, and I gave him the short version, the version that made it sound smaller than it was, because I'd learned a long time ago that the long version tended to invite skepticism from people who'd already decided before I opened my mouth roughly how impressive my life was allowed to be. By the time the best man stood up to give his toast, I'd mostly relaxed into the low hum of being ignored, which had its own strange comfort to it. Being ignored at least didn't cost anything. It was the version of the evening I knew how to survive. I had no idea. Watching the best man wrap up his toast with a joke about college that got a warm, easy laugh from the room, that the worst part of the evening hadn't started yet, and that when it did, it would be my own brother standing at the microphone who started it. My brother stood, took the microphone from the best man with a grin, and the room changed before he'd even said a word. I felt it more than saw it at first. A kind of collective straightening, chairs shifting, conversations trailing off mid-sentence as people turned their attention toward the head table. My mother lifted her phone to record, angling it carefully like she'd been waiting for this exact moment all evening. His new wife turned toward him with that soft, glowing, trusting expression brides wear during toasts. The expression that says, whatever you're about to say, I already love it because I love you. My brother looked past all of them. He looked straight at me. A cold, small feeling moved through my stomach, the specific dread of recognizing a pattern half a second before it repeats itself. Before we keep celebrating, he said, tapping the microphone once for emphasis, I want to introduce someone very special. A few heads turned, scanning the room for whoever this special someone might be. My sister's here tonight, he continued. Come on, stand up. Don't hide back there by the kitchen. Heat crawled up my neck in that instant, fast and total, the way it does when you realize a room full of people is about to be pointed directly at you and there is nothing you can do to stop it. I stood because staying seated would have made whatever was coming worse, would have looked like I was cowering, and some stubborn part of me refused to give him that image to work with, even as everything else in me wanted to disappear into the floor. There she is, my brother said, grinning at the microphone like he'd just unveiled a magic trick. Meet my loser sister who still lives with roommates. For one full second, the room didn't seem to know what to do with that. It was too specific to be an obvious joke, too oddly personal for a wedding toast, and I watched confusion flicker across a few faces near the front before someone, somewhere, laughed. And once one person laughed, permission had apparently been granted, because the sound spread from table to table like something spilled, catching and rippling until it had filled most of the ballroom. My fingers tightened around the stem of my champagne glass hard enough that I could feel the bubbles trembling against the rim. My brother held up one hand, a universal gesture for calming an audience after a particularly good line, clearly delighted with the response he was getting. No, I'm serious, he said, and I could hear in his voice that he meant to keep going, that this wasn't a single cutting joke he intended to move past quickly. 31 years old, still splitting an apartment like she's in a college dorm. He paused for effect, letting that land before turning toward his new wife and lifting his glass. Meanwhile, some of us grew up, got real jobs, married real women. That line got the biggest laugh of the night so far, a genuine roar from several tables at once, and I watched his new wife's smile falter for just a fraction of a second before she caught herself and smoothed it back into place. Whatever she was actually feeling, she'd apparently decided this wasn't the moment to show it. My mother looked down at her napkin and started folding it into smaller and smaller squares. My father took a long, slow sip of water, the kind of sip that looks rehearsed, designed to give his face something to do other than react. My brother could see he still had the room, and a room like that, once you have it, is a dangerous thing to keep holding on to. She was supposed to be the genius, he said, shaking his head like the memory amused him. Remember that, Mom? Always building things, always talking about how she was going to change the world someday. He shrugged, a broad, theatrical gesture meant to be seen from every table. And now, still doing some tech thing with her little roommates, someone near the front murmured something I couldn't quite hear, followed by another wave of laughter, lighter this time, but still present, still landing. I wanted, more than almost anything I've ever wanted, to sit back down and disappear into the noise of the room, to let this become one more thing I absorbed quietly and carried home to process alone later, the way I'd absorbed every version of this joke for the last decade. But something in me, some small, stubborn thread that had apparently been fraying for years without my noticing, refused to fold in front of a ballroom full of people laughing at a version of my life that had never been true. So I stayed standing, back straight, cheeks burning, champagne glass shaking slightly in my grip, and I let my brother use his own wedding toast to bury me alive in front of everyone either of us had ever known, because I genuinely did not know in that moment what else there was to do. His new co-workers, seated near the front of the room, were eating up every word, one of them leaning over to say something to the man beside him, both of them grinning in my direction like I was part of the scheduled entertainment for the evening. I stood there and thought, absurdly, that this was almost funny, in the specific way that things become funny only once they've become unbearable, that my brother had managed to find an audience of literal strangers who would laugh at a stranger's expense purely because he'd told them to. I thought, this is almost over. He'll run out of things to say eventually. He always does, once he's said enough to feel like he's won. That's when his expression shifted, brightening for reasons that plainly weren't about me anymore, and he glanced toward the entrance at the back of the ballroom. "Oh, wow," he said, genuine surprise coloring his voice for the first time all evening. "Looks like my new boss actually made it." The ballroom doors at the back swung open, and for a moment I let myself feel something close to relief, the small, petty kind of relief you feel when you think the spotlight is finally about to swing away from you and onto someone else. A man in a dark navy suit stepped through, unhurried, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that makes a noisy room correct itself without anyone needing to ask it to. I heard the whispers start almost immediately. Moving through the tables near the front in that fast, low way news travels through a crowd before anyone says anything out loud. My brother straightened visibly at the podium, adjusting his jacket, his whole posture shifting into something more careful, more performed. "See?" he said into the microphone, raising his glass toward the man now crossing the room. "That's what happens when you're actually valuable to a company." He said it to me, but loud enough for the whole room, a little parting shot before he moved on to whatever came next in his toast, a comparison apparently too good to resist even in the middle of greeting his own boss. For just a moment, watching my brother scramble slightly to compose himself, watching the easy confidence he'd been riding for the last several minutes falter as he tried to figure out the right blend of casual and impressed to project toward a superior who'd shown up unannounced to his wedding, I felt something almost like satisfaction. Here was a small, ordinary discomfort finally landing on him instead of me. He was nervous. He was recalculating in real time how to look good in front of someone whose opinion of him actually mattered to his paycheck. The same anxious recalculation I'd watched him force onto other people my entire life without ever once having to feel it himself. I actually let myself think, for a few seconds, that this might be the whole shape of the evening's turn. That the boss would take a seat somewhere near the front, my brother would finish his toast a little more carefully now that a superior was in the room, and the night would settle back into its ordinary shape, me quietly absorbing what had already been said, him slightly more subdued for having an audience he actually needed to impress. It felt briefly like accidental cover, like the universe had sent someone to distract him before he could do any more damage, and that would be enough. That would be the whole resolution I was going to get. An unplanned interruption rather than any real reckoning. I watched the man's gaze sweep the room as he walked, taking in the tables, the flowers, the general architecture of the celebration, the way anyone does when they're new to a space and orienting themselves. My brother had already half turned back toward the microphone, visibly relaxing now that the man hadn't beelined for the head table demanding attention, apparently satisfied that his boss's presence would remain a background detail rather than a disruption. That relief lasted exactly as long as it took the man to keep walking. He didn't stop near the front tables. He didn't scan the room for an open seat, the way a guest arriving late to a wedding usually does, apologetic and a little unsure of where they belong in a seating chart they weren't part of. He walked straight down the center aisle, past the head table entirely, past my parents, past my brother mid-sentence, past every single person who'd just been laughing at me, until he was standing directly in front of table 19, in front of me. And in that instant, the false comfort I'd been holding onto collapsed all at once, replaced by something else entirely, something I didn't yet have words for, because whatever was about to happen clearly had nothing to do with distracting my brother and everything to do with something I hadn't seen coming at all. He said my name, just my name, nothing attached to it, no title, no awkward greeting fumbled together laughter for a stranger at a wedding he technically hadn't been invited to. He said it the way you say the name of someone you've been trying to reach all day, with something close to relief in his voice. Then he pulled me into a hug, right there in front of 200 people, in front of the kitchen doors and table 19, and every person who'd been laughing less than 5 minutes earlier. The laughter behind me died so fast and so completely that I could hear the air conditioning humming somewhere above the dance floor, a sound I hadn't noticed once all evening until the silence made room for it. Over his shoulder, I caught a glimpse of my brother's face, still angled toward the microphone, frozen mid-expression in a way that would have been almost comical under any other circumstances. His mouth stayed open, still shaped around whatever word he'd been about to say before the room's attention had physically pivoted away from him and toward me. The man stepped back, keeping one hand resting lightly on my shoulder, the kind of gesture that says, "I know this is a lot, I'm here," without needing to say any of those words directly. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said, and there was an ease to how he said it, the ease of someone completely unbothered by the fact that 200 strangers were now staring at him. The board meeting ran longer than anyone expected. "We still need your signature tonight if we're going to close this before Monday." A ripple moved through the tables closest to us, low voices repeating fragments of what they'd just heard. Board meeting, signature, close this. The words meant nothing yet to most of the room, but the shift in tone was unmistakable. The sense that something had just walked into the evening that didn't belong there at all, something carrying its own weight and its own timeline, entirely separate from cake or dancing or toasts. My brother blinked at us, glancing rapidly between the man's face and mine, like he was waiting for someone to break character and admit this was some kind of elaborate joke, a prank staged specifically to embarrass him back after the toast he'd just given. When neither of us offered him that out, something in his expression shifted from confusion toward the beginning of real unease. "You two know each other?" he asked into the microphone, and I could hear, even through the sound system, how much smaller his voice had gotten compared to a few minutes earlier. The man finally turned to face him fully, and I watched him take in my brother for the first time. Really look at him, the way you look at someone you're about to explain something to that they very clearly do not want explained. "Of course," he said. "She's the lead on the acquisition." And his new wife's expression shifted slowly, her bouquet trembling faintly in her hands. "Acquisition?" she repeated, like the word had landed somewhere she hadn't expected it to. I watched the man's eyes move around the room, taking in the frozen expressions, the half-raised glasses nobody seemed to remember they were holding, the same people who'd been laughing at me a few minutes earlier now looking anywhere except at each other. "The board approved the transaction tonight," he said, careful and measured, the tone of someone used to delivering information that changes the shape of a room. "Pending final signatures, the company moves under new ownership as of Monday morning." My brother's voice, when it finally came, sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "What does that have to do with her?" "Everything," the man said simply. "She represents the group leading the acquisition." Somewhere near the front, a chair scraped audibly against the floor. My mother half rose from her seat, one hand pressed to her chest, and whispered my name in a tone I didn't recognize, something between disbelief and the beginning of an apology she didn't yet have the words for. I didn't look at her yet. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I looked too soon, I'd see something that would hurt worse than anything my brother had said all night, some flicker of regret arriving 20 years too late to matter, and I wasn't ready to carry that on top of everything else the evening had already handed me. My brother lifted the microphone again, almost like a shield, something to hide behind while he tried to make sense of what was happening. "That can't be right," he said. "She lives with roommates." The word landed strangely this time, the same word he'd used 10 minutes earlier to make me small in front of everyone we both knew, now hanging in the air with nowhere left to go, stripped of the power it had carried just a few sentences ago. "Her co-founders," the man said, correcting him without any particular heat, simply stating a fact that happened to dismantle an entire narrative in 4 words. I felt something settle in me then, a stillness that wasn't quite calm and wasn't quite anger, but something adjacent to both. For years, I had protected my brother from having to confront this. I'd let him mock me at family dinners because correcting him always felt like begging for something I shouldn't have had to ask for in the first place. I'd let my parents absorb his version of my life because proving myself to people who'd never once asked a real question about it felt exhausting in a way that was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. But standing there, with his insult still hanging in the air over 200 witnesses, I understood something clearly for maybe the first time in my adult life. I didn't owe him my silence anymore. "You told everyone I was barely getting by," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. "You've told them that for years, and you never once asked me what I actually built." "I was joking," he said, but the word came out thin, unconvincing, even to his own ears from the look on his face. "No," I said, "you weren't joking. You just didn't expect the joke to walk through the door and correct you in front of everyone you were trying to impress." He opened his mouth to respond, and nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my brother stood in front of a room with no smirk ready, no easy line to redirect the crowd's attention back onto my side of things, no comfortable joke to retreat into. Behind him, I could hear the whispers building again, faster this time, a different quality to them than the laughter from before. Someone from his office leaned toward another guest and murmured something I couldn't quite catch. His new wife's father, seated at one of the front tables, was watching my brother with an expression like he'd just watched something expensive crack. My mother had started crying quietly into her napkin, and I genuinely couldn't tell whether it was for me, or for herself, or for some accumulation of every year she'd spent not asking the questions that might have gotten her here sooner, on my side of this moment instead of watching it happen from a distance. The man beside me glanced at his watch. "The legal team is still waiting," he said gently, not pushing, just letting me know the option was there. there. I nodded, and as I turned to leave, I looked at my brother one final time. He was standing under the floral arch in his perfect suit at his perfect wedding, surrounded by every single person he'd spent the entire night trying to impress, and somehow, in that moment, he had never looked smaller. "Congratulations," I said. I hope the applause was worth it. I walked out before the room could decide what to do with what it had just seen. The man's hand steady at my elbow, the doors of the ballroom swinging shut behind us on a silence I could still feel through the wall as we crossed the lobby.